For instance, I can remember a time during a service at a church, and the Spirit of God was in it so high that the Spirit of God hit me and my brother so hard that we couldn't even be contained throughout the rest of the service. But when the service was over and it was time to go home, before we could take one step outside of the church to go home, my mother told us both, y'all better put on your coats before you go out there, because you could and you will catch a cold. But I got news for you. There are too many saints that haven't caught a cold, but we've caught the spiritual flu. It's a flu that Motrin cannot help, Tylenol cannot help, and aspirin definitely can't help, and no kind of flu medicine can help. But the sad thing about it is that we have become so polluted that we don't even want to change. The church has become content with just coming to church. Somewhere we have went wrong. The doctrine of holiness is being compromised. No longer is there a balance in the church. We're either too spiritual or we're too carnal. There is a devil that has walked up in the church, which has spoken to young musicians and told them that you can play music and still have sex outside of marriage. Oh, Lord, help me in here. It's the same devil that walked up in the Garden of Eden and told Eve that you can eat of that forbidden fruit and still be like God. Somewhere we have lost focus that it's all about Jesus and not us. And the reason being is because there is an evil power in the atmosphere that is trying to control the mind of God's people. But I want you to understand that this force main target is not just us only, but it is the pastors. It is attacking the leadership to get them to go astray from God's glory, because by doing this he knows that there will be a great percentage of God's people that will fade away with them. Help me, Jesus. This is the same problem that we find in 1 Samuel chapter 12 verse 17, when Samuel told King Saul, is it not wheat harvest today? I will call unto the Lord, and he shall send thunder and rain, that he may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, which ye have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking you king. So over in the next chapter we find in verse 13 that when Samuel said this to Saul, he said to him, thou hast done foolishly, thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God. So by clearly examining these two verses, we clearly see that King Saul has changed completely. And it wasn't for the best, but rather for the worse. But we all know that's not how King Saul started off. Oh, we know the story how Israel wanted a king because all the other nations had one. But yet they failed to realize that when you have God, you have enough. So people of God, I stopped by here to tell you that having Jesus is a necessity. But too many people are overtaken by the cares of this world, and they lose their focus on Jesus. But I don't have time to start on that tonight. I gotta move on. But as we move on through this story, we see that God, he chose this man and he wanted to use him. God told Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 1 that there was a son of Benjamin whose name was Kish, and he said that son's name was Saul. Saul was God's choice. He was a good man. The Bible goes on to say that there was no other person in Israel like him. There was no other person in Israel fitted for the job. job. So God knew what he was doing. But some may say, well, if he knew what he was doing, then why did he choose him if he knew that he would mess up? Well, I have to ask you to ask that question to yourself and say, why did he choose me to come into the kingdom? If God knew the foolishness that I would do even after I got saved, then why in the world did God choose to save me? I would say that God chose Saul to prove to Israel that if I'm your God and you're my people, then I want you to know that when something goes wrong, that it ain't over until I say that it's over. And if you will allow me to digress, I will tell you that when one door shuts, don't lose your mind, because you're going to need your mind to walk through the next door that's about to open. Don't lose your mind when you lose your dream home and you don't have no more money and you have to move into a smaller home that crowds you in, because you're going to need that same mind to walk through the mansion that God has for you. Don't lose your mind when somebody cuts you off and leave you by yourself, because you're going to need your mind for who God's about to send your way. Let me leave it alone. So that is why God chooses King Saul. And as we move on throughout the story, I got to hurry up. We find that in this nation, that this nation is beginning to ruin because the adversary overtook the leadership. And as a result, we see that Samuel is becoming overwhelmed with grief in his spirit because of the way things are going over in Israel. But in this same book, we see in chapter 16 verse 1 that God speaks to Samuel and says to him, how long will you mourn for Saul?